Tonight, before sleep slowly finds you, let your heart rest in Jesus' presence. I want to tell you a quiet story of His endless grace. Not a loud story. Not the kind filled with danger or noise. Just a gentle story for tired hearts. A reminder that even in your darkest hours, God is watching over you. Our story begins late at night. The last train had already left the city. Rain rested quietly against the windows of the nearly empty station, and cold wind moved through the narrow platform outside. Only a few lights remained on. Most of the shops were closed. The coffee machines had stopped humming hours ago. And somewhere far down the tracks, a faint metallic sound echoed briefly through the darkness before fading away again. Daniel sat alone on one of the old wooden benches near platform 4. His tie hung loose around his neck. His coat rested beside him, and exhaustion clung to him more heavily than the rain outside. He had missed the final train home by less than 3 minutes. 3 minutes. After another long, exhausting day in the city. That small failure somehow felt much larger than it should have. But Daniel had forgotten the promise of the scripture, that when we run out of our own strength, God's strength begins. For a while, he simply stared at the empty tracks. Dark rails stretching endlessly into the distance beneath flickering station lights. The station clock read 12:47 a.m. And according to the screen above the platform, the next train would not arrive until morning. Normally, a younger version of Daniel might have become angry, frustrated, impatient. But tonight, he only felt tired. The kind of tiredness that reaches deeper than the body. The kind of deep weariness Jesus spoke of when he said, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Daniel had been rushing through his days, completely forgetting how to surrender and rest in him. The rain outside became softer now. Only a quiet drizzle tapping gently against the station roof. And somewhere near the far end of the platform, an old janitor slowly pushed a broom across the concrete floor. The sound moved steadily through the silence. Soft, unhurried, almost peaceful. Daniel leaned back against the bench and closed his eyes for a moment. The station smelled faintly of wet pavement, coffee, and cold night air drifting in through the open entrance doors. Everything around him felt strangely suspended, as though the world itself had paused for a few quiet hours before morning returned again. Then unexpectedly, a voice spoke nearby. "Long night?" Daniel opened his eyes slowly. An older man stood a few feet away holding 2 paper cups of coffee. Gray coat, worn leather gloves. But his eyes, they possessed a deep, eternal peace, as though he knew every sorrow Daniel had ever carried. There was an undeniable warmth around him, like a gentle light shining in the damp, cold night. Daniel gave a tired smile. Something like that. The older man nodded knowingly and handed him one of the coffees without asking another question. "The world can be a cold place when you try to carry everything alone," he said softly, handing Daniel the cup. "But you are never truly alone, Daniel. I have always been here with you. Daniel let out the faintest laugh. The first real laugh he had made all day. And somehow, that small moment mattered more than either of them said aloud. The older man lowered himself carefully onto the bench beside him. For a while, neither of them spoke. They simply sat together listening to rain touch the station roof while cold night air drifted quietly through the empty terminal. And strangely, the silence did not feel awkward. It felt restful, like the kind of silence that exists when nobody expects anything from you anymore. After a few minutes, the older man finally spoke again. People always think train stations are sad places, he murmured. Daniel glanced toward him curiously. The man looked out toward the dark tracks ahead. But I've never believed that. He smiled faintly. I think train stations are full of weary, lost souls, he murmured, looking at the tracks. People desperately searching for direction, completely forgetting that if they just trust the Lord with all their heart, He will make their path straight. Daniel looked down at the warm coffee resting between his hands. Something about those words stayed with him immediately. Because lately, he too had felt caught between versions of himself. The person he once imagined becoming, and the exhausted man sitting quietly beneath station lights after midnight. The older man seemed to notice the heaviness in his expression. Work? He asked gently. Daniel nodded. Mostly. But even he knew the answer was larger than that. It was not only work. It was the constant rushing. The pressure. The endless feeling that life was moving too fast to fully breathe inside it anymore. The old station clock ticked softly overhead. 12:58 a.m. Outside, the rain continued falling lightly across the empty tracks. And somewhere beyond the sleeping city, a distant train horn echoed faintly through the darkness like a lonely memory traveling across the night. The older man wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and spoke quietly. You know something strange? Daniel looked toward him. Most people spend their whole lives trying to arrive somewhere. He paused briefly and forget to notice where they already are. The words settled softly into the silence between them. And for reasons Daniel could not explain, they felt painfully true. For a while, neither of them spoke again. The station remained wrapped in a quiet stillness that only exists after midnight. Rain tapped gently against the roof overhead. Somewhere far down the empty platform, an old vending machine buzzed softly in the darkness. And every few minutes, cold wind drifted through the station entrance carrying the faint smell of wet pavement and distant rain. Daniel took another sip of the coffee. It was too bitter. Too hot, yet strangely comforting. The kind of coffee that feels less important than the simple fact someone offered it to you. The older man sat calmly beside him, watching the empty tracks ahead. He did not seem impatient, did not check his watch, did not appear bothered by the late hour at all. And somehow, that calmness felt unusual to Daniel, because everyone he knew seemed rushed lately, always hurrying somewhere. always thinking about the next task, the next deadline, the next responsibility. Even rest had started feeling scheduled. But this man, he looked completely unbothered by time, as though he had made peace with slowness a long time ago. Finally, Daniel asked quietly, "Are you waiting for a train too?" The older man smiled faintly. "Not tonight." He nodded toward the tracks. "I just come here sometimes." Daniel looked confused. "Why?" The man leaned back slightly against the bench. For a few moments he seemed to search for the right words. Then softly he answered, "Because people become honest in places like this." Daniel frowned slightly. The older man continued watching the rain. Airports, hospitals, train stations. A faint smile crossed his face. Places where people are leaving something behind, or hoping something better waits ahead. The station lights flickered once overhead before becoming still again. And Daniel quietly realized he had not had a real conversation like this in a very long time. Not about work, not about schedules, not about practical things. Just life. Somewhere nearby, the janitor finished sweeping and disappeared through a side hallway carrying his broom slowly over one shoulder. The station became even quieter after that. Only rain remained. Rain and the distant humming of electric lights. Daniel stared at the tracks ahead. "Do you ever feel like life moves too fast?" he asked quietly. The older man chuckled softly under his breath. "Only every day." Daniel smiled faintly. Then after a moment he added, "I used to think things would slow down eventually." The older man glanced toward him. "But they didn't?" Daniel shook his head slowly. "It feels like the older I get, the faster everything moves." The words seemed to disappear into the quiet station air. And perhaps that feeling belongs to more people than anyone admits aloud. One day childhood feels endless. Then suddenly, years pass quietly beneath routines and responsibilities until people wake up wondering where all the time went. The older man folded his gloves carefully in his hands. "You know what I think?" he murmured. Daniel looked toward him again. "People lose their peace gradually," he whispered. "They get so caught up in the worries of tomorrow that they forget tomorrow is already in God's hands. Too much rushing, too little prayer." The rain outside softened even more now. Barely more than mist touching the tracks. And eventually, the older man continued softly. "People become so focused on surviving life, they forget how to actually experience it." Those words landed somewhere deep inside Daniel. Because lately, that was exactly how his days had begun feeling. Wake up tired, rush through work, answer emails, ignore stress, come home exhausted, sleep badly, repeat, again and again until entire months disappeared. The station clock quietly shifted to 1:16 a.m. The night continued moving slowly forward, unhurried, patient, And sitting there beneath the dim station lights, Daniel felt something unusual happening inside him. Not happiness exactly, just stillness. The kind of stillness he had not felt in longer than he could remember. Then unexpectedly, the older man stood from the bench. "Come on," he said gently. Daniel looked up. "Where are we going?" The man smiled faintly toward the nearly empty station. "There's a bakery across the street that stays open all night." He slipped his gloves back on slowly. And no meaningful conversation should end with station coffee. For the first time that entire evening, Daniel laughed properly. A quiet, tired laugh that seemed to loosen something heavy inside his chest. Then he stood from the bench too. And together, the two of them walked slowly toward the station exit while rain continued falling softly outside beneath the sleeping city. The cold night air greeted them gently as they stepped outside the station. Rain still drifted lightly through the streets, though now it felt softer than before. More like mist floating through the glow of streetlights than an actual storm. The city had become almost completely empty. Traffic lights changed quietly at deserted intersections. Closed shop windows reflected pale gold across the wet sidewalks. And somewhere in the distance, a siren echoed briefly before disappearing back into silence. The older man walked slowly beside Daniel with his hands tucked inside the pockets of his gray coat. He did not seem hurried at all. Even crossing the street felt unhurried. Calm. As though there was nowhere else in the world he urgently needed to be. And Daniel realized how unfamiliar that kind of peace had become to him. The bakery sat on the corner across from the station beneath a flickering sign that simply read, "Open." Warm yellow light spilled softly through fogged windows onto the wet pavement outside. Inside, only two customers remained. A woman reading quietly near the back wall, and a truck driver sitting alone with headphones resting around his neck. The smell of fresh bread and cinnamon drifted warmly through the air. For a moment, Daniel simply stood near the entrance taking it all in. Something about places open late at night always felt different from the daytime world. More honest somehow. Less rushed. As though exhaustion itself had softened everyone enough to stop pretending for a few hours. The older man nodded toward a booth near the window. "Sit wherever you like." Daniel slid quietly into the seat while rain traced slow patterns down the glass beside him. Outside, the station lights still glowed faintly across the street. The older man removed his gloves carefully and glanced toward the menu hanging above the counter. "You hungry?" Daniel almost said no automatically, then realized he actually was. Very. He had skipped dinner without noticing earlier that evening. "A little," he admitted. The older man smiled. That usually happens when people spend too much time worrying. A few minutes later, a plate of warm bread and soup rested between them. The older man broke the bread gently, and as he did, Daniel felt a strange, holy warmth fill the room, as if he were part of something sacred. The simple act of breaking bread brought an unexplainable peace to his restless soul. Not because it was extraordinary, but because life had become so rushed lately that he could barely remember the last time he sat somewhere peacefully without staring at a screen while eating. The older man tore a small piece of bread slowly. "People underestimate quiet moments," he murmured. Daniel looked toward him. "How do you mean?" The man dipped the bread into his soup thoughtfully. "People always look for miracles in big storms and loud thunder," he said softly, his voice blending with the gentle rain outside. "But God usually speaks in a still, small voice. He speaks in a quiet evening, a warm cup offered by a stranger, or a simple moment of absolute stillness." Rain continued sliding gently down the bakery windows. A cup of coffee with someone. A conversation after midnight. A peaceful walk home. His eyes softened slightly. Those moments become important later. Daniel listened carefully, because deep down, he knew the man was right. Some of the memories that stayed with people forever were strangely small. A song playing through an open window during summer. The smell of dinner from childhood kitchens. Late-night conversations with people who are no longer around. Tiny moments, yet somehow unforgettable. The bakery remained quiet around them. Soft music drifted from an old speaker near the counter. The truck driver yawned heavily into his coffee. Outside, rain clouds moved slowly above the sleeping city. And for the first time in many months, Daniel no longer felt trapped inside his own thoughts. The pressure in his chest had softened enough for him to simply exist in the moment for a while. The older man leaned back slightly in the booth. "Can I tell you something strange?" he asked. Daniel nodded. The man looked out toward the dark streets beyond the window. "Most people spend their entire lives waiting for a grand moment to make life feel meaningful," he said, looking out into the dim street. "But the beauty of God's creation is that meaning is usually hidden inside the ordinary blessings people rush past every day. To notice them, one must learn to walk slowly." Daniel looked down quietly at the warm soup resting in front of him. Steam rising slowly. Rain falling softly outside. The low hum of the bakery lights. And suddenly, something very simple became painfully clear to him. He had been rushing through his life so quickly. He had stopped fully living inside it. The realization did not feel dramatic, just quiet. Like a truth his soul had already known for a long time finally catching up with him. And somewhere beyond the fogged bakery windows, the long night continued moving peacefully toward morning. For a while, they simply ate in silence. Not uncomfortable silence, the kind that feels calm enough to rest inside. Outside the bakery windows, rainwater shimmered beneath streetlights while the empty city remained wrapped in deep early morning stillness. Every now and then, headlights drifted quietly across the glass before disappearing again into the darkness. Daniel noticed something strange while sitting there. His breathing had slowed. The tightness in his shoulders had eased. Even the endless rushing inside his thoughts felt farther away now. And perhaps peace often arrives so quietly. People almost miss the moment it enters the room. The older man stirred his coffee slowly. "You know what people regret most?" he asked gently. Daniel looked up. The man smiled faintly. "Not usually failure." He glanced toward the rain outside. "Most people regret the moments they were too distracted to fully live." The bakery lights hummed softly overhead. Too distracted to notice the blessings God has placed right in front of them. Too distracted to enjoy ordinary evenings, and too distracted to quiet their minds in prayer. Daniel sat very still after hearing those words. Because lately, distraction had become his entire life. Even during quiet moments, his mind stayed somewhere else, thinking ahead, replaying problems, planning tomorrow before today had even ended. And after a while, life itself had begun feeling distant to him, like he was always standing slightly outside his own days instead of truly living inside them. The truck driver eventually stood from his table near the counter. He nodded politely toward them before disappearing out into the rainy night. The bakery became even quieter after that. Only soft music remained drifting through the room. A slow piano melody almost blending into the sound of rain. Daniel looked toward the older man again. "So how do you stop it?" The man raised an eyebrow gently. "Stop what?" Daniel searched briefly for the words, feeling like life is passing too fast. For a moment, the older man did not answer. He simply watched the rain moving slowly across the bakery window. Then finally he spoke. "You learn how to pay attention again." Daniel frowned slightly. The older man smiled. "Most people are physically present for their lives, but mentally somewhere else." He gestured softly toward the window. "They miss entire seasons of joy that God has gifted them because they are too busy worrying about the troubles of the next one." The rain outside had nearly stopped now. Only scattered drops remained sliding down the glass. But when people slow down enough to notice small things again, life changes. Daniel listened carefully. The man continued quietly. The smell of coffee in the morning, wine through open windows, conversations that aren't rushed, a peaceful walk at night. A faint smile crossed his face. Small things heal people more than they realize. Somewhere in the kitchen behind the counter, fresh bread was being placed into ovens for the morning crowd that would arrive hours later. Warm air drifted gently through the bakery carrying the smell of butter and cinnamon. And sitting there beneath the soft lights with rain fading outside, Daniel suddenly remembered something he had not thought about in years. He remembered Saturday mornings from his childhood. His mother humming a soft and quietly while making breakfast. The warm sunlight streaming through the kitchen curtains. It was a time when he trusted blindly that he was safe and taken care of, long before life became complicated. The memory arrived so unexpectedly that it almost hurt. Not because it was sad, but because it reminded him how long it had been since he last felt truly peaceful. The older man seemed to notice the distant look in his eyes. "What are you thinking about?" he asked gently. Daniel hesitated before answering. Nothing important, but the older man smiled knowingly. Usually the important memories are the quiet ones. Daniel looked down into his coffee, and after a long silence, he finally admitted something aloud he had never fully said before. "I don't know how to let go of the weight anymore," Daniel confessed. The older man looked at him with endless compassion. "You were never meant to carry it alone, Daniel. Cast your burdens onto me, and I will sustain you. My yoke is easy, Daniel, and my burden is light. Just give it all to me tonight. Because perhaps more people feel that way than anyone realizes. People become so accustomed to stress, so familiar with constant pressure, that rest itself begins to feel unnatural." The older man leaned back gently in the booth. "Then maybe tonight is a good place to start." Outside, the rain had finally stopped completely now. Clouds drifted slowly above the sleeping streets while somewhere far away, the faintest hint of approaching morning waited beyond the dark horizon. The bakery grew quieter with every passing minute. Even the music had softened now. Only a faint piano melody drifted gently through the warm air before fading beneath the silence again. Outside, the wet streets reflected long ribbons of gold beneath the streetlights. The storm had fully passed, and the city seemed to be resting peacefully in its aftermath. Daniel leaned back against the booth and stared through the fogged window beside him. For the first time in a very long while, he was not thinking about work, not checking the time, not mentally preparing for tomorrow. He was simply there, present inside the moment. And somehow, that felt unfamiliar enough to almost seem strange. The older man wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "People think rest is something they'll eventually reach," he said quietly. Daniel looked toward him again. The man smiled faintly. "But rest is something you practice." The bakery lights reflected softly in his tired eyes. "Otherwise, life keeps teaching the body to stay tense, even when there's no reason to." Daniel listened silently. Because lately, even peaceful moments had felt difficult for him. His mind stayed alert constantly, like some invisible part of him no longer knew how to stop preparing for problems that had not even happened yet. The older man glanced toward the dark streets outside. "A lot of people are exhausted," he murmured. "Not because they're weak, but because modern life rarely becomes quiet anymore." Daniel nodded slowly, and perhaps that was true. The world remained loud all the time now. Phones, news, schedules, notifications, pressure. Even moments meant for rest became filled with noise. The older man continued gently. "Human hearts need silence sometimes." He smiled faintly. Not empty silence, peaceful silence. The ovens behind the counter clicked softly as fresh bread baked in the kitchen. Warmth drifted through the bakery, and for a few moments, everything around them felt deeply calm. Then unexpectedly, the older man pointed toward the station across the street. A single train slowly rolled past the empty platform without stopping. Its windows glowed softly against the darkness before disappearing farther down the tracks. "You know what I always loved about trains?" he asked quietly. Daniel shook his head. The man watched the distant tracks thoughtfully. "They remind people that movement is natural." He paused briefly. "Nothing stays in one place forever." Daniel followed the fading lights of the train until they disappeared completely. And somehow, those words settled deeply inside him too. Because difficult seasons often feel endless while people are living inside them. Stress feels permanent. Loneliness feels permanent. Exhaustion feels permanent. Yet life keeps moving quietly forward whether people notice it or not. Storms pass. Nights end. Hearts slowly heal. For a while, neither of them spoke again. The silence itself had become comforting now. Like sitting beside an old friend after years of carrying too many thoughts alone. Daniel looked around the nearly empty bakery. The sleepy cashier behind the counter. The warm lights. The rain-soaked streets outside. Nothing extraordinary was happening. Yet somehow, this ordinary night already felt unforgettable. And perhaps that is because peaceful moments become rare once people grow older. Not impossible. Just rare enough that the soul recognizes them immediately when they finally arrive. The older man eventually checked the old clock hanging near the kitchen. Nearly 3 in the morning. He smiled softly to himself. Morning's getting close. Daniel looked toward the dark sky outside. It still looked like night, but something about the air had changed. The darkness no longer felt heavy, only quiet, like the world itself slowly preparing to wake again. The older man stood slowly from the booth. "Come with me," he said gently. Daniel blinked. "Where?" The man slipped his gloves back on carefully. "There's somewhere I think you should see before sunrise." Daniel almost asked more questions. But strangely, he didn't feel the need to. So he stood quietly from the booth too. And together, they stepped back out into the peaceful sleeping city while the final hours of night drifted softly around them. The air outside felt cleaner after the rain. Cool wind moved softly through the empty streets while puddles reflected the glow of fading streetlights beneath the dark sky above. For a while, they walked without speaking. Their footsteps echoed quietly along the sidewalks while the sleeping city rested around them. Daniel noticed how different the world felt at this hour. No crowded traffic. No rushing voices. No pressure hanging in the air. Only silence. Only the distant hum of a city breathing slowly before morning. And somehow, the stillness itself felt healing. The older man kept an unhurried pace as they moved farther away from the station district. Past closed flower shops. Past dark apartment buildings. Past quiet cafes with empty chairs stacked behind rain-covered windows. Every now and then, a faint light glowed inside some distant apartment where another sleepless soul was still awake somewhere above the city. Eventually, they reached a narrow street lined with old trees dripping softly from the earlier rain. At the very end of the street, an iron gate stood partially open beside a stone pathway. Daniel slowed slightly. Beyond the gate rested a small park overlooking the river. The older man glanced toward him. "Almost nobody comes here at night," he said quietly. They stepped through the gate together. The park felt completely untouched by the noise of the city. Rain rested along wooden benches. Tree branches moved gently in the wind. And beyond the pathway, the river flowed quietly beneath the darkness like black glass moving through the sleeping world. For a few moments, Daniel simply stood there taking it in. The peacefulness of the place felt almost unreal, as though the city had disappeared completely behind them. The older man walked toward a bench overlooking the water and sat down slowly. Daniel joined him quietly. Neither of them seemed eager to disturb the silence. Across the river, a few distant lights shimmered softly against the dark water. Clouds drifted slowly overhead, and somewhere far away, a church bell rang faintly through the night air, its gentle chime echoing like a whisper of God's calling before fading back into the absolute stillness. The older man rested his hands together thoughtfully, watching the quiet water. "When I was younger," he murmured, "I used to think peace came after everything in life was finally solved." Daniel listened quietly. The man smiled faintly toward the river. "But life never really works that way." Wind brushed softly through the trees above them. "There's always another problem eventually. Another responsibility. Another uncertainty." He paused briefly. "So if people wait for a perfect life before allowing themselves peace, they may spend their whole lives waiting." Daniel stared silently at the river. Because deep down, he knew he had been doing exactly that. Always postponing rest until some future version of life finally became easier. After this project, after this stressful season, after things settled down. But things rarely settled down completely. Life simply kept moving. The older man looked toward him gently. "Peace is never found in perfect circumstances, Daniel," he whispered. "The peace I give you is not like the peace the world offers. It is found in trusting me completely, learning how to rest in my presence while the world keeps changing around you." The water continued flowing steadily through the darkness. Unhurried, constant, almost comforting to watch. For a long moment, Daniel said nothing. Then finally he asked quietly, "Do you ever regret things?" The older man smiled softly to himself. "Of course." Daniel looked toward him. The man watched the river carefully before answering again. "Every life has mistakes," he said, looking at the flowing river. "But my grace is sufficient for you. Your past is washed clean, just like this water. Let it go." Daniel lowered his gaze slightly, because there were deep regrets he still carried in the dark corners of his heart. Guilt he replayed quietly at night, and mistakes he wished he could undo. But as he looked at the older man, He felt those heavy chains breaking away. Years that seemed to disappear beneath work and stress before he even realized they were gone. The older man noticed the sadness in his expression. "Most people think healing means forgetting," he murmured. "But often healing simply means learning how to remember without reopening the wound every time." The river moved gently beneath the dark sky. And somewhere behind the clouds, the first faint traces of approaching dawn had begun quietly touching the horizon. Daniel leaned back slowly against the bench. The air felt colder now, but his chest felt lighter than it had earlier that night. Not because his problems had disappeared, but because for the first time in a very long while, he had stopped running from himself long enough to simply breathe. And sitting there beside the river in the final quiet hours before morning, that felt like enough. For a while, they remained there beside the river without speaking. The world around them felt suspended between night and morning. Not fully dark anymore. Not yet daylight either. Only that soft, quiet hour where everything seems gentler somehow. Daniel watched the slow movement of the water beneath the bridge. Rain from earlier still clung to the railing beside him, catching faint traces of light from the city behind the trees. Somewhere nearby, leaves shifted softly in the wind. And from far away, another church bell echoed faintly through the sleeping streets. The older man closed his eyes briefly as though listening to the silence itself. Then after a while he spoke again. "Most people spend their lives afraid of stillness." Daniel glanced toward him. The man smiled faintly. "Because when everything becomes quiet, people finally hear the thoughts they've been avoiding." The river continued flowing gently beneath them. So they stay busy, stay distracted, stay surrounded by noise. He looked out toward the water again. Anything to avoid sitting alone with themselves. Daniel lowered his gaze quietly, because he understood exactly what the man meant. Work had not only become responsibility for him, it had become escape too. As long as he remained busy enough, he never had to fully face how exhausted he had become. The older man rested one hand along the wooden bench. "But silence is not always the enemy people think it is," he murmured. "Sometimes silence is where healing finally begins." Daniel breathed slowly as cold air drifted around them. And perhaps that was true. Because tonight, in the middle of this quietness, he felt more emotionally awake than he had in months. A faint pale color had begun appearing far beyond the horizon now. Morning was approaching slowly. The city lights no longer looked as bright against the changing sky. Birds would begin singing soon. People would wake. Coffee shops would open. Traffic would return. The world would become loud again. But for now, everything remained peaceful. Daniel looked toward the older man. "Do you come here often?" The man nodded slightly. "Whenever life feels too fast." A faint smile crossed his face. "I think people need places that remind them to breathe." Daniel looked back toward the river. And suddenly he realized he could not remember the last place that made him feel peaceful before tonight. Everything in his life lately had been built around urgency, efficiency, deadlines, movement. Even weekends felt crowded. The older man reached into his coat pocket slowly and pulled out a small folded photograph. Its corners were worn with age. He handed it gently to Daniel. As they walked back to the platform, the morning light began to break through the clouds. Daniel looked at the older man, feeling a lightness in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. The older man smiled gently. "I have known you since before you were formed, Daniel. I have always been watching over you." There was warmth in his voice, but sadness too. Gentle sadness, the kind carried peacefully after many years. The older man looked out toward the quiet water ahead. "I love this place," he murmured softly, his voice spreading across the cool morning air. "Whenever my children feel lost or heavy burdened, I bring them here before sunrise to remind them that the world is always kinder when you rest in me." The words settled softly into the cool morning air. And somehow, Daniel understood exactly what she meant. For a while longer, they simply watched the river together. No advice, no dramatic revelations, only quiet companionship beneath the fading darkness. And perhaps that was what made the night feel meaningful. Not because everything had suddenly changed, but because for the first time in a long time, Daniel no longer felt alone inside his exhaustion. The sky continued growing lighter now. Soft shades of gray and pale blue slowly replacing the darkness above the city. Morning was arriving gently, without rushing, without force. The same way peace sometimes returns to the human heart, little by little. Then finally, the older man stood from the bench. Daniel looked up. The man smiled kindly toward him. "You should head home soon." Daniel stood slowly too. And strangely, the thought of returning home no longer felt heavy. They walked quietly back toward the street together while the river flowed steadily behind them. The city was beginning to wake now. A few cars moved through distant intersections. Bakery lights glowed warmly on nearby corners. And somewhere above the rooftops, morning light slowly spread across the sky. When they reached the station again, the older man stopped walking. Daniel turned toward him. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Then softly, the older man said something Daniel would remember for the rest of his life. "Don't wait for life to become perfect before allowing yourself peace." The station lights flickered faintly behind them. Quiet moments matter more than people realize. Daniel nodded slowly, because somewhere during the long night, he had begun understanding that already. And standing there beneath the soft morning sky, he realized something important. He had arrived at the station exhausted, disconnected, emotionally numb from moving too quickly through life. But now, something inside him had softened. Not completely healed, not suddenly transformed, just quieter. lighter somehow, like his soul had finally exhaled after holding tension for far too long. The older man gave him one final, gentle smile before turning away. Daniel looked down for just a second to adjust his coat, and as he turned to thank him, the bench was completely empty. The older man was gone, disappearing as quietly as the morning mist. Daniel's heart raced, but not with fear, with an overwhelming sense of holy peace. Resting on the wooden bench right where the man had been sitting was a small, beautifully carved wooden cross. And beside it, a handwritten note that read, "I am with you always, even unto the end of the world." Daniel stood there watching for a moment. Then slowly, he looked up at the brightening sky above the city. And for the first time in many months, he did not feel in a hurry to get somewhere else. Daniel remained standing outside the station for a little while longer. Morning had fully begun arriving now. Soft sunlight stretched gently across the wet streets while the last traces of night disappeared between buildings and rooftops. The city was waking slowly. A bus sighed to a stop nearby. Someone unlocked the door to a flower shop across the street. The smell of fresh bread drifted again through the cool morning air from the bakery on the corner. Ordinary things. Small things. Yet somehow, they felt different to him now. For so long, he had moved through life without fully noticing it. Always thinking ahead. Always rushing toward the next responsibility. As though peace only existed somewhere further down the road. But during this long, strange night, something quiet inside him had shifted. Not dramatically. Not in the kind of way movies often show. There was no sudden miracle. No perfect clarity about the future. Only a gentle realization slowly settling into his heart. Life had been happening around him the entire time, and he had almost missed it. Daniel looked once more toward the platform where the older man had disappeared moments earlier. Crowds were beginning to form there now. Commuters carrying coffee cups. Students adjusting backpacks. Workers staring sleepily at glowing phone screens. The normal rhythm of another day quietly beginning again. Yet somehow, the station no longer felt cold or lonely to him anymore. It felt human. A place full of tired people trying their best to carry invisible things through ordinary days. And perhaps everyone is carrying something unseen. Pressure. Grief. Loneliness. Regret. Hope. Most people never speak openly about it. They simply continue moving through life while quietly hoping for moments of peace along the way. Daniel slipped his hands into his coat pockets and began walking slowly toward home. Not rushing this time. Just walking. Listening to the soft sounds of morning around him. Birds somewhere above the rooftops. Wind moving gently through the trees lining the street. The distant clatter of trains beginning another day across the city. As he walked, he noticed things he normally ignored. Steam rising from cafe windows. Sunlight reflecting in puddles left behind by the rain. An elderly man watering plants outside a tiny shop before opening for the day. Tiny ordinary moments, yet strangely beautiful when finally noticed. And perhaps peace often hides inside moments exactly like these. Not inside extraordinary experiences, but inside ordinary life lived slowly enough to actually feel it. The morning air felt cool against his face. His body was tired. He still had responsibilities waiting for him later that day. Problems still existed. Nothing about life had magically become easy overnight. Yet his chest no longer felt as heavy as before, because something important had changed. He no longer felt disconnected from his own life. The older man's words echoed softly in his memory. Don't wait for life to become perfect before allowing yourself peace. Daniel repeated the sentence quietly to himself while walking beneath the pale morning sky. And deep down, he knew he would carry those words with him for a very long time. Eventually, he reached his apartment building. The city behind him had grown brighter now. Morning traffic beginning. People hurrying toward work. Another busy day unfolding everywhere around him. But before entering the building, Daniel paused for one final moment. He looked upward toward the calm sky above the city. Then slowly, he closed his eyes and breathed deeply. Not rushed, not distracted, just present. And standing there quietly beneath the morning light, he realized something simple yet deeply important. A peaceful life is not built from perfect circumstances. It is built from small moments fully lived. Warm coffee after midnight. Rain against station windows. Conversations that arrive unexpectedly. Quiet rivers before sunrise. The courage to slow down enough to actually experience your own life again. Then finally, Daniel opened his eyes. A faint, peaceful smile crossed his face. And now, as you lay your head down tonight, remember that the same Jesus is standing right beside you. Cast all your worries upon him, for he cares for you. Let go of tomorrow. Close your eyes. Rest. Sleep in his perfect peace. Amen. As the echoes of Daniel's journey fade into the night, let your own heart find its resting place. You have carried the weight of the world all through the day, but tonight, you are permitted to let it go. Let these simple truths settle deep into your soul as you drift closer to sleep. are safe in the shelter of the Almighty. The God who watches over the stars is watching over your room and your thoughts tonight. There is nothing more for you to fix, nothing more for you to solve before tomorrow. His grace is enough. His presence is your peace. Take one more gentle, deep breath in. Feel his comfort wrapping around you. And as you breathe out, release the very last of your worries. And now, let us begin another quiet journey into the stillness of God's grace. Tonight, I want to tell you another story. One meant for the quiet hours of the night, when the world grows still and thoughts begin to wander gently. So settle comfortably. Let your breathing slow, and allow yourself to drift into the rhythm of this story. Far from crowded streets, far from city lights, there stood a lighthouse on the edge of a rocky coastline. It had stood there for longer than most people could remember. Through storms, through winters, through countless sunrises and countless nights. Year after year, the lighthouse remained, watching over the sea. The nearest town was nearly 20 miles away. Most visitors never came that far. There were no busy shops nearby, no traffic, no glowing office buildings, only cliffs, wind, waves, and the endless horizon stretching beyond the dark water. The lighthouse keeper's name was Samuel. Most people simply called him Sam. He was 63 years old. His hair had turned silver long ago. His hands carried the rough marks of decades spent working near the sea, and his face held the quiet expression of someone who had learned how to live without rushing. Every evening, just before sunset, Sam followed the same routine. He climbed the narrow spiral staircase that wound its way to the top of the lighthouse. One step at a time, slowly, patiently, the staircase creaked beneath his boots exactly as it had for years. And by now, he knew every sound the old lighthouse made. At the top, he would clean the glass carefully, check the light, inspect the equipment, and then wait for darkness to arrive. The work itself was simple. There were no emergencies most nights, no dramatic rescues, no excitement, just consistency. The same quiet responsibilities repeated day after day. Some people would have found the life boring, lonely even, but Sam never described it that way. Because after many years beside the ocean, he had learned something most people never fully discover. Silence and loneliness are not always the same thing. As the sun slowly disappeared each evening, the sea would begin changing colors. Golden light becoming orange, orange becoming deep blue, and eventually, everything fading into darkness except the beam of the lighthouse sweeping across the water. Again, And again, and again. Sam loved that moment. The first few minutes after sunset, when the world seemed to hold its breath, when birds returned to their nests, when fishing boats became distant shadows along the horizon, when the ocean grew darker and quieter beneath the evening sky. Every night, after checking the lighthouse one final time, he would sit beside a small wooden desk near the tower window. The desk was old, older than he was. Its surface carried scratches from many years of use, and inside its drawer rested dozens of worn notebooks. Not official records, not work logs, personal journals, the kind nobody else was ever meant to read. For nearly 20 years, Sam had written something every single night. Sometimes only a few sentences, sometimes several pages. Whatever happened to be on his mind. He wrote about the weather, about ships passing through the darkness, about memories that occasionally returned without warning, about things he noticed while most of the world slept. Small observations, simple thoughts, ordinary moments. One evening he wrote, "The sea looks silver tonight beneath the moon." Another night, a single fishing boat crossed the horizon at 2:14 a.m. And another, the stars seemed brighter after the storm passed. Nothing dramatic, nothing extraordinary. Yet somehow, those pages had become one of the most important parts of his life. Because writing forced him to pay attention, to notice things, to remain present. And over the years, he had discovered that paying attention often made ordinary moments feel far richer than people expected. Tonight felt much like any other evening. A cool wind moved across the cliffs. Clouds drifted slowly overhead, and the lighthouse beam swept steadily across the dark water below. The world felt calm, predictable, peaceful. Sam sat beside the window with a cup of tea warming his hands. Beyond the glass, the ocean stretched endlessly into the darkness. Moonlight shimmered softly across the waves. And somewhere far away, a ship moved slowly along the horizon like a tiny floating star. For a long time, he simply watched, listening to the steady rhythm of the sea below, the distant crash of waves against rocks, the occasional cry of a seabird drifting through the night air. It was the kind of silence many people would have struggled with. But to Sam, it felt familiar, comforting even, like an old friend who never needed to speak. Then something unusual happened. A light appeared near the shoreline. Very small, very distant, barely visible against the darkness. Sam frowned slightly. Visitors almost never came here at night, especially not this late. He set his tea down slowly and moved closer to the window. The light remained there, steady, motionless, near the old path that wound its way up the cliffs toward the lighthouse. And for reasons he could not quite explain, he felt curious, not worried, just curious. Because after years of living beside the sea, he had learned that unexpected things often arrived quietly, much like the tide itself. The light remained visible for another moment. Then slowly, it continued moving up the cliffside path. Not quickly, not like someone in a hurry. Just a steady glow rising through the darkness, one careful step at a time. Sam remained beside the window watching. The path leading to the lighthouse was narrow and uneven. Visitors rarely used it after sunset. In fact, weeks sometimes passed without another person appearing at all, which was perfectly fine with him. He had never chosen this life because he wanted to avoid people. He simply happened to love quiet places. And over the years, the lighthouse had become one of those places. As the light moved closer, he could tell it was a lantern. An old-fashioned one. The kind people carried before phone screens and bright flashlights became common. Its warm glow swayed gently with each step. Appearing, disappearing, appearing again behind the tall grass lining the path. Sam glanced at the clock hanging near the desk. It was nearly 1:45, an unusual time for visitors. Very unusual, but not impossible. The sea often attracted people carrying thoughts they could not quite sort through anywhere else. For many years, he had noticed something interesting. People rarely visited the lighthouse when life was going well. They came after loss, after change, after disappointment, after endings. Something about the ocean seemed to draw people during those seasons. Perhaps because the sea understood uncertainty better than anyone. It was always changing, always moving, never remaining exactly the same. A few minutes later, a gentle knock echoed through the lower level of the lighthouse. Not loud, not urgent, just respectful. The kind of knock that asks permission rather than demanding attention. Sam made his way down the spiral staircase slowly. The familiar wooden steps creaked beneath his boots. One turn, then another, then another. The sound of waves grew louder as he descended. And by the time he reached the door, the night air had already begun slipping through the gaps around the frame. He opened it carefully. Standing outside was a young woman holding the lantern. Perhaps 28, maybe 30. It was difficult to tell in the darkness. Her coat was damp from ocean mist. A backpack rested over one shoulder. And although she offered a polite smile, her eyes looked tired. The kind of tiredness sleep alone cannot fully fix. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Only wind moved softly through the grass around the lighthouse. Then finally, she spoke, her voice gentle and almost hesitant. "Sorry to bother you so late. The town hotel was full tonight." She glanced toward the ocean briefly. "And someone mentioned there might be a caretaker here who knows the area." Sam nodded once. "There is." The woman laughed softly. It was the first genuine sound of warmth that had appeared on her face since arriving. Good. For some reason, that single word carried more relief than the situation seemed to require. The wind shifted again. Colder this time. Sam stepped aside slightly. "You'd better come in before the weather changes its mind." She smiled gratefully. And a few moments later, both of them stood inside the lighthouse while the door closed gently behind them. The warmth felt immediate. Not because the lighthouse was particularly warm. It wasn't. But compared to the ocean wind outside, it felt welcoming, comforting. The young woman removed her coat slowly. And for the first time, Sam noticed how exhausted she seemed. Not physically, emotionally, as though she had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. He had seen that look before. Many times. Throughout life, people often arrived carrying invisible weight, responsibilities, heartbreak, disappointment, regret. Most burdens were impossible to see from the outside. Yet somehow, they always revealed themselves through tired eyes. "Tea?" Sam asked. The woman smiled. "That would be wonderful." A few minutes later, they sat near a small table beside the lighthouse window. Steam curled gently upward from two mugs. Outside, the beam continued sweeping across the dark water beyond the cliffs. Again, and again, and again. Its steady rhythm seemed to calm the room somehow. For a while, they simply listened to the ocean. No need to fill every silence. No pressure to explain anything immediately. The kind of silence that feels comfortable rather than empty. Finally, the woman looked toward the sea. "It's beautiful here." Sam nodded. "It usually is." A small smile appeared on her face. "Usually, the storms have opinions." She laughed quietly. A real laugh this time. Small, but genuine. The conversation drifted naturally after that. Nothing particularly important at first. The weather, the cliffs, the old lighthouse, the tiny town several miles away. Simple subjects, easy subjects. The sort people discuss while deciding whether they trust one another enough to speak honestly. Eventually, the woman looked down into her tea. The smile faded slightly, and for a moment, she seemed far away, lost somewhere inside her own thoughts. Then softly she asked, "Do you ever feel like you ended up somewhere completely different from where you thought life would take you?" The question arrived unexpectedly. Yet questions like that rarely appeared at the beginning of conversations. They waited patiently beneath the surface until people felt safe enough to ask them. Sam did not answer immediately. He simply held the warm mug between his hands, choosing not to rush. The best conversations rarely benefited from hurried responses. Outside, waves rolled steadily against the rocks below the cliff. The lighthouse beam continued its endless journey across the sea. And somewhere beyond the darkness, a distant foghorn echoed softly through the night. The young woman waited quietly, thoughtfully, as though she had been carrying that question around for a long time. Finally, Sam nodded. Yes. The answer was simple. Honest. Nothing more, nothing less. The woman looked toward him, and somehow that single word seemed to surprise her. Not because of what he said, but because of how calmly he said it. Sam smiled faintly toward the window. When I was younger, I thought I knew exactly what my life would look like. The ocean shimmered beneath the moonlight outside. Most people do, he chuckled softly. Life usually has other ideas. The woman traced a finger slowly around the edge of her mug. That's exactly how I feel. Her voice was quiet now, almost lost beneath the sound of the waves. A few years ago, everything seemed clearer. Or at least I thought it did. Sam listened without interrupting. There was something people often forgot. Most hearts do not need advice first. They need space. Space to unfold what they have been carrying. Space to speak honestly. Space to feel heard. The woman looked out toward the sea. Have you ever spent years building a version of your life, only to realize one day it doesn't fit anymore? The room became quiet again, the question hanging gently in the air between them. Sam nodded, not because he fully knew her story, but because he understood the feeling. Life changed people. Sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once. Dreams changed. Priorities changed. Even identities changed. And often, the hardest part was accepting that growth itself could require letting go of old versions of ourselves. Outside, clouds drifted slowly across the moon. The room darkened briefly before the lighthouse beam swept past the window once more. A moving ribbon of light crossing the walls, then disappearing again. The woman finally took a deep breath. "My name is Claire, by the way." Sam smiled. "Nice to meet you, Claire." She laughed softly. "I probably should have started with that." Probably. Both of them smiled, and for a moment, some of the heaviness in the room eased. Claire looked down into her tea again. 3 months ago, I left my job." Sam raised an eyebrow slightly. "That's a big change." She nodded. "Everyone thought I was making a mistake." The words came carefully, like stepping stones across deep water. Maybe they were right. For the first time that night, uncertainty showed clearly in her face. Not fear exactly, just doubt. The quiet kind that follows major decisions. The kind that keeps people awake at night wondering whether they misunderstood their own hearts. "What did you do?" Sam asked gently. "Corporate law," the answer came immediately, almost automatically, the way people answer questions they have repeated 1,000 times before. Sam nodded slowly as Claire stared toward the ocean. "I spent 8 years doing it. Good salary. Good reputation. Good future. At least according to everyone else." The wind brushed softly against the lighthouse windows, and somewhere below, waves continued their patient conversation with the shoreline. "But?" Sam asked. Claire laughed quietly. "There's always a but, isn't there?" She looked toward the sea. For a moment, it seemed as though she was watching something far beyond the horizon, something only she could see. "But every morning I felt farther away from myself." The words arrived softly. Without drama. Without bitterness. Just truth. I kept telling myself things would improve. Next month. Next year. After the next promotion. Her eyes lowered again. But eventually I realized I was waiting for a future version of life that never seemed to arrive. The room remained still. The ocean continued breathing beyond the cliffs. And Sam listened, not trying to fix anything, not trying to offer quick wisdom. Simply listening. Because sometimes, the most meaningful thing one person can give another is their full attention. Nothing more, nothing less. Claire wrapped both hands around the mug again. So I left. The words sounded both brave and uncertain at the same time. Everyone thought I had lost my mind, she laughed softly. Some days I think they might be right. Sam smiled. And the other days? For the first time all evening, a genuine light appeared in her eyes. Small, but real. The other days, she looked out toward the dark ocean. The other days I finally feel like I can breathe. Outside, the waves continued rolling toward the shore. Steady, patient, unconcerned with deadlines, unconcerned with expectations, simply moving according to their nature. The room grew quiet again after that. Not because the conversation had ended, but because some truths naturally create silence after they are spoken aloud. Claire watched the water through the lighthouse window. For a long moment she said nothing, then finally she smiled faintly. It sounds strange saying it out loud, that I left. For years it felt impossible. Sam nodded. Most difficult decisions feel impossible right up until the moment they happen. Claire laughed quietly. That's not particularly comforting. No, Sam admitted, but it's usually true. Both of them smiled. The wind brushed against the tower windows again. Not aggressively, just enough to remind them the sea was still there beyond the glass, watching, waiting, moving beneath the moonlight. Claire stared into her tea. The strange thing is, leaving wasn't actually the hardest part. Sam remained silent, giving her room to continue. The hardest part was what came afterward. Once all the noise stopped, the room became still, and Sam understood immediately. Not the details, but the feeling. Because many people imagine freedom will instantly feel wonderful. Yet sometimes, when a long chapter ends, the silence that follows can feel unsettling at first. Claire looked toward the ocean. For years my schedule told me who I was. My job. My responsibilities. My routine. She traced a finger along the edge of the mug. Then suddenly all of it disappeared. And I realized I wasn't entirely sure who I was without it. Outside, a few stars appeared between drifting clouds. Small points of light resting above the dark water. Quiet. Steady. Unconcerned. Sam leaned back slightly in his chair. Most people spend years building careers. Claire nodded. That's normal. It is, Sam smiled softly, but sometimes they accidentally build their identity around them too. The words settled gently between them, not as criticism, just observation. Claire looked thoughtful, because deep down, she knew there was truth in it. For years, whenever someone asked who she was, the answer began with what she did. Not what she loved. Not what brought her peace. Not what made her feel alive. Only work. The realization felt uncomfortable, yet strangely freeing at the same time, like opening a window inside a room that had been closed for too long. The lighthouse clock ticked quietly somewhere behind them. Midnight had long since passed, yet neither of them seemed aware of the time anymore. The conversation had found its own pace. Slow. Natural. Unforced. Claire looked around the lighthouse, the worn wooden shelves, the old books stacked near the wall, the journals resting on Sam's desk, the lantern hanging beside the staircase. Everything felt lived in. Nothing felt rushed. Were you always a lighthouse keeper? Sam laughed softly. Not even close. Claire raised an eyebrow. No. No. A smile touched his face. When I was younger, I lived in the city. That answer surprised her. Really? Really? For a moment, Sam looked out toward the sea, as though searching through old memories floating somewhere beyond the horizon. Then he smiled to himself. There was a time I couldn't sit still for 5 minutes. Claire laughed. I don't believe that. Most people don't. The lighthouse beam swept across the room again. A familiar arc of light. Patient. Reliable. Endlessly returning. I spent years chasing things, Sam continued quietly. Money. Success. Recognition. His eyes remained on the water. And there's nothing wrong with those things. Until they become the only things. Claire listened carefully. The ocean breathed beneath the cliffs. The stars drifted slowly above the sea. And somewhere beyond the lighthouse walls, the world remained beautifully still. "What changed?" she asked, her voice soft like a whisper. Sam smiled, not because the answer was simple, but because it had taken him years to understand. He looked toward the dark horizon one more time, then quietly said, "One day I realized I had become successful at everything except being present in my own life." The words hung gently in the air, and somewhere inside Claire, they landed harder than she expected. Because perhaps that was exactly what she had been afraid of becoming too. For a while, neither of them spoke. The kind of silence that follows an honest sentence. Not awkward, not empty, just thoughtful. Outside, the ocean stretched endlessly beneath the night sky. Claire sat quietly with Sam's words. "Successful at everything except being present in my own life." The sentence lingered. For years, she had been checking boxes, meeting goals, doing exactly what everyone said she should do. And somehow, the farther she went, the farther away she felt from herself. The strange part was that nobody else seemed to notice. From the outside, everything looked successful. That was the difficult thing about certain kinds of exhaustion. They were invisible. People saw achievement. They did not see emptiness. Claire looked toward the ocean again. "Were you scared? When you changed your life?" The question remained suspended between them as the lighthouse beam swept softly across the room. Sam smiled. Terrified. Claire laughed unexpectedly. A genuine laugh, the first one that came without effort all evening. "Really?" "Absolutely," he shook his head. People like to rewrite their memories later and pretend they were brave. The corners of his eyes crinkled gently. Most of us are simply uncertain and moving forward anyway. Outside, a seabird called somewhere beyond the cliffs, its distant cry drifting briefly through the darkness before vanishing into the wind. Claire leaned back in her chair. For the first time since arriving, she felt herself relaxing. Not because she suddenly had answers, she didn't. Her future remained uncertain, the next chapter unwritten. But somehow, the uncertainty felt less frightening here. Perhaps because the ocean itself was uncertain. The weather changed. The tides changed. Yet none of those changes seemed wrong, they simply belonged to life. Sam stood slowly from his chair, his joints protesting slightly. Claire smiled. "Long day?" "Long decade," he replied. She laughed again as he walked toward one of the shelves lining the wall and carefully removed a weathered notebook. Its cover had faded with age, the edges of its pages softened over the years. Returning to the table, he placed it gently in front of Claire. "What's this?" "One of my journals." She looked surprised. "You're letting me read it?" Sam smiled. "One page." Claire opened the notebook carefully. The handwriting was neat and steady, the kind that develops through patience rather than speed. Most pages contain short observations, descriptions of sunsets, storms, and changing seasons. Then one particular entry caught her attention. It was dated nearly 15 years earlier. She read quietly. "Today I spent 20 minutes watching sunlight move across the water. That was all. Nothing else. No grand lesson, no dramatic story. Just one sentence." Claire looked up. "That's it?" Sam nodded. That's it. She smiled in confusion. Why write that down? Sam looked toward the ocean, his answer coming slowly. Because that day I realized I had spent years too busy to notice sunlight. The room became quiet again. Claire looked back at the sentence. 20 minutes watching sunlight move across the water. Such a small thing, yet suddenly, it seemed important. Not because of the sunlight, but because of the attention. She thought about how many beautiful moments had passed through her own life unnoticed. How many sunsets had been missed while checking emails. Life had not been absent, she had simply been elsewhere, constantly focused on the next thing. The realization was uncomfortable, but strangely peaceful too. Maybe peace was not hiding somewhere far away. Maybe it had been quietly waiting inside ordinary moments all along. Outside, the wind softened, the ocean settling into a slower rhythm. Claire closed the journal carefully and handed it back. Neither of them spoke for a while. There was no need. Some nights are remembered because something exciting happens. Other nights are remembered because something inside quietly changes. The lighthouse stood steady above the cliffs, the night slowly deepening, and Claire sat near the window watching the ocean. No matter how dark the night became, the lighthouse continued doing what it was built to do. Not loudly, just faithfully. For some reason, Claire found herself thinking about that. About how much of life seemed focused on becoming something bigger, more impressive, more noticed. Yet here stood a lighthouse that had spent decades quietly helping people without asking for recognition. Outside, a fishing vessel moved slowly in the distance, its tiny lights flickering gently against the darkness. For a moment, it looked less like a boat and more like a star floating upon the water. Sam noticed her watching it. That boat comes through every Tuesday night. Claire glanced toward him. You know that? He smiled. You notice things when you stay somewhere long enough. The answer sounded simple, but it carried deep meaning. Modern life often encouraged people to move quickly from one task to another, rarely staying still long enough to truly know a place, a person, or even themselves. The room remained warm, the tea had long since cooled, and for the first time in many months, Claire felt no desire to check the time. Usually she tracked every hour, every meeting, every deadline. Yet tonight, time seemed less important, as though the ocean itself had convinced the clock to slow down. Sam stood near the window, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the horizon. Then quietly he asked, "When was the last time you felt completely at peace?" The question arrived gently, without pressure. Claire opened her mouth to answer immediately, then stopped. Because surprisingly, she did not know. There had been happy, successful, exciting moments. But peace? True peace? That was harder to find. She thought carefully, searching through years, until a small memory surfaced, one she had not thought about in a very long time. I was 11, the words escaped before she fully realized it. Sam smiled softly. 11? Claire nodded, a faint laugh slipping from her lips. I was staying with my grandparents during summer vacation. They had a small cabin near a lake. Every morning my grandfather would wake up early and sit on the dock. He never seemed in a hurry. I remember sitting beside him one morning before everyone else woke up. We didn't really talk. We just watched the lake. Sam nodded quietly, understanding. Some memories require very few words. And somehow, that morning felt complete. Claire looked toward the sea, letting the memory settle gently. Outside, clouds drifted slowly apart, and more stars appeared above the ocean. The world seemed larger somehow, yet calmer. Sam smiled. Interesting. Claire looked toward him. What? Your memory wasn't about achievement. She thought about that. He was right. There had been no success involved, no award, no productivity. Just a quiet morning beside someone she loved. And perhaps that was the lesson hidden inside so many people's lives. The moments that matter most are rarely the ones people spend years chasing. They are often the ones quietly happening while nobody is keeping score. Claire leaned back in her chair, feeling a sense of belonging inside her own life again. The long conversation continued gently into the night. Sam eventually walked toward the window, the old wooden floor creaking beneath his footsteps. He looked out toward the sea, then smiled faintly. The fog is coming. Claire followed his gaze. At first she didn't see it, then gradually, a pale blanket of mist began appearing along the surface of the water, moving slowly, patiently, almost silently. Within minutes, the horizon began disappearing. The stars nearest the ocean faded, the distant fishing vessel vanished from sight, and the sea itself seemed softer, blurred around the edges. Claire watched quietly. It's beautiful. Sam nodded. It always is. The fog continued rolling inward, covering the water little by little. Then Sam said something unexpected. Life becomes foggy sometimes too. Claire looked toward him, but the old lighthouse keeper remained focused on the sea. People usually panic when they can't see far ahead. They want certainty. Most of the time certainty isn't available. The beam swept through the mist, a glowing path of light disappearing into whiteness. When that happens, Sam continued quietly, people think they're lost. But often they're simply being asked to trust the next few steps instead of the next few years. The room fell silent, only the distant crash of waves remaining. Those words stayed with Claire because lately, that had been her greatest struggle, not knowing what came next, wondering whether she had made the right decision. For someone who had spent years planning everything, uncertainty felt terrifying. But looking at the fog now, she noticed something. The lighthouse beam was still working, still guiding, even though it couldn't illuminate the entire ocean. It only revealed a small section at a time. And somehow, that was enough. The realization settled quietly inside her. Maybe nobody was meant to see the entire journey. Maybe seeing the next step was often enough. Eventually Claire stood and stretched gently, wandering toward the bookshelf lining one wall of the tower. Dozens of books rested there, weather journals, sea stories, poetry, and maps. One particular book caught her eye, its spine cracked with age. She pulled it free carefully. You've read all of these? Sam laughed softly. Most of them more than once. Why? Sam smiled. Because good books change as people change. Claire looked puzzled. He nodded toward the novel in her hands. The story stays the same, but the reader doesn't. Claire stood there thinking about that. Perhaps the same thing was true of life. Experiences that once seemed meaningless suddenly became important years later. The world changed because people changed. Outside, the fog continued thickening around the lighthouse, transforming the tower into a small island of light surrounded by mist. Peaceful, quiet, timeless. Claire returned to her chair near the window. The room felt warmer now, more familiar, like a place her spirit recognized. And for the first time in many months, she stopped trying to figure everything out, stopped trying to solve the future before it arrived. Instead, she simply listened to the waves, to the wind, to the lighthouse, and to the stillness. And in that stillness, something within her finally began to rest. Sam poured fresh tea into both mugs, the warm scent filling the room. Claire smiled. "You drink a lot of tea." Occupational requirement. For people who spend long nights thinking. The answer made her smile because tonight felt like one of those rare nights where thinking no longer felt exhausting. It felt meaningful and gentle, like sorting through old boxes in an attic and rediscovering things that had been forgotten for years. For a long while, they talked about small things, favorite books, old memories, places they had traveled. Simple conversations, yet they felt richer than many serious ones Claire had experienced in recent years, because nobody was trying to impress anyone. Nobody was competing. Just two people sharing a quiet night beside the sea. Eventually the conversation slowed again, because both of them had become comfortable with silence, comfortable enough to simply exist inside it. Claire rested her head gently against the back of the chair as the fog swirled around the lighthouse. Slowly, very slowly, the darkness outside began to soften. Not noticeably at first, just slightly, the kind of change people only recognize after it has already begun. Morning was approaching. Something in the air had changed. The world seemed to know dawn was coming even before the sky did. Sam noticed it too. He stood slowly and walked toward the window, watching the horizon hidden behind the fog. Then quietly he said, "My wife used to love this hour." Claire looked toward him. The smile on his face was gentle and warm, touched by memory. "Why?" Sam kept his eyes on the sea. "Because she believed this was the most honest part of the day. Night is finished, but morning hasn't arrived yet. She used to call it the hour between chapters. The world isn't what it was yesterday anymore, but it hasn't fully become tomorrow yet either." The room fell silent once more, and Claire thought about her own life, about endings and beginnings. Perhaps she too was living in the hour between chapters. Not lost, not finished, simply transitioning. Like night becoming morning, like fog eventually becoming sunlight. The faint light of approaching dawn continued spreading slowly through the fog, softening the darkness. Sam opened one of the desk drawers and pulled out a very old notebook, older than the others, its pages yellowed slightly with time. He ran his hand gently across it before opening it, almost like greeting an old friend. "This was my first journal here. 21 years ago." Sam turned slowly through the pages, reading quietly to himself, occasionally smiling at an old memory. Then he stopped on a particular page, and the silence deepened. "What is it?" Claire asked gently. Sam smiled. "A mistake." She laughed softly. "You wrote down your mistakes?" "Some of them." His eyes remained on the page, the important ones. Sam closed the notebook halfway and looked out toward the fog-covered sea. "When I first arrived here, I spent years believing I had wasted my life." The words came calmly, without bitterness or regret. Just truth. Claire blinked, surprised, because from where she sat, Sam seemed more at peace than anyone she had met in a very long time. He smiled faintly. "Most people assume peaceful people have always been peaceful. That's rarely true. For a long time I carried regret for years spent chasing things that never truly mattered, regret for moments I missed, regret for relationships I neglected while pursuing success." Claire listened carefully, hearing the wisdom earned slowly, the expensive kind that people learn only through living. One morning, Sam continued, I was standing exactly where you're sitting now, watching a sunrise over the water. And I realized something. The past had already taken enough from me. Yet every day I spent regretting it. I was giving it even more. Outside, the fog shifted slightly, revealing a small section of ocean for a moment before covering it again. That morning I stopped asking how much time I had wasted, and started asking how I wanted to spend the time I still had. Claire felt something stir inside her. That was the question she had been avoiding. How did she want to spend the years ahead? The answer had nothing to do with job titles or expectations. It had everything to do with how she wanted to live. The sky continued brightening, the darkness slowly retreating, and the fog beginning to thin at its edges. Claire realized she no longer felt quite as afraid of what came next, because she no longer believed she needed all the answers right now. Sometimes, the next step is enough. The fog had begun thinning further, revealing tiny openings, a patch of water here, a distant rock formation there. Claire found herself smiling because it reminded her that clarity rarely arrives all at once. Most of the time, it comes exactly like this, a little at a time, until eventually, the path ahead no longer feels hidden. The lighthouse beam continued turning, though its light seemed softer now against the brightening sky. Its work nearly finished for the night. Soon daylight would take over. Sam stood near the window, watching the horizon with a peaceful expression. Outside, a few seabirds appeared, their silhouettes gliding through the pale morning light, making the world feel awake again. Claire wrapped her hands around her mug one final time. The tea had cooled completely, yet she didn't seem to mind. She was thinking about everything the night had given her, perspective. Life was not a puzzle meant to be solved all at once. It was something lived and experienced, not controlled. The realization felt strangely freeing, like setting down a suitcase she had been carrying for far too long. Outside, the ocean finally revealed itself completely as the fog retreated toward the horizon. The water caught the first traces of sunlight, everything returning, everything renewed. Sam smiled faintly. There it is. Claire followed his gaze. Far beyond the sea, the edge of the sun had begun rising above the horizon, spilling soft gold across the water. Gentle, warm, and beautiful. Neither of them spoke. Some moments feel smaller when words are added, so they simply watch the sunrise, the ocean, and the beginning of another day. For the first time in a very long while, Claire wasn't thinking about what came next or worrying about 5 years from now. She was simply present, exactly where she was. The morning continued growing brighter. Sam walked toward the lighthouse lamp, the great light that had turned faithfully all night long, and switched it off. The room became a little quieter, a little stiller. Its work was finished until evening. Claire smiled as she watched. That feels symbolic somehow. Sam laughed softly. Everything feels symbolic after a long night. Outside, the fishing boats were now clearly visible against the morning sea, the fog having nearly vanished. Claire stood and walked toward the window one last time. Part of her wished she could remain here just a little longer, but life does not ask people to stay in one chapter forever. Eventually, every traveler must continue the journey. A sunrise matters because it doesn't last. A conversation matters because it eventually ends. Claire picked up her backpack, the same one she had carried up the cliff the night before, yet somehow it felt lighter now emotionally. The invisible weight she had arrived with no longer felt quite as heavy. Before leaving, she glanced once more toward the desk, the journals, and the worn wooden floor, then her eyes settled on Sam. Can I ask one final question? He nodded. Of course. Claire smiled faintly. After all these years, after everything you've learned, what do you think matters most? Sam looked out toward the sea, where the sunlight danced across the water, considering every year that had brought him here. Then finally he answered, quietly and honestly, I think paying attention matters most. Pay attention to the people you love. Pay attention to ordinary mornings. Pay attention to the seasons of your life while you're living them. Because one day you'll discover those ordinary moments were never ordinary at all. The room became silent, and Claire felt the truth of those words settle deep inside her. For years she had been waiting for life to begin, waiting for the next achievement, while life had been happening quietly all around her, in conversations, in sunsets, in walks. Now she was beginning to understand. And perhaps beginning is enough. The morning light filled the lighthouse, and Claire walked toward the door. Sam accompanied her outside, and together they stepped into the fresh coastal air. The cliffs glowed softly beneath the morning sun, and the path leading back toward town waited peacefully before her. For a moment, they stood there without speaking, the kind of goodbye that doesn't require many words. Then Sam smiled, and Claire smiled back before turning toward the path. One step, then another, then another. Moving forward, not because she had every answer, but because she no longer believed she needed them all before beginning. The lighthouse remained behind her, steady and quiet, watching over the sea. And as Claire disappeared slowly down the cliffside path, the morning sun climbed higher into the sky. A new day beginning, a new chapter opening, and somewhere within her heart, a small but important piece had finally found a place to stay.